Look at what happens when a relationship built on hyperfixation and emotional running finally hits a wall of absolute silence. The avoidant walks away assuming they have reclaimed their freedom, maintained their frame, and left the empath crushed, waiting, and perpetually available. The empath sits in total quiet, fighting through the sheer agony of a shattered attachment system. To an untrained observer, it appears as though the avoidant won the game of power. But in behavioral profiling and psychological dynamics, short-term relief is the ultimate illusion before systemic breakdown. When an avoidant and an empath both enter absolute no contact, an invisible high-stakes neurochemical timer begins ticking. The avoidant believes silence is their weapon of control. They do not understand that silence operates on two completely different psychological timelines. While the empath is forced to confront their pain, process the trauma bond, and rebuild their internal sovereignty, the avoidant is silently accumulating psychological debt. They are running on borrowed time, suppressing feelings that are hardwired to explode the moment they realize the empath is never coming back. If you exit this room right now, you will keep misinterpreting their silence as strength, allowing their ghost to hold your emotional baseline hostage. Stay right here. Over the next few minutes, we will deconstruct the behavioral mechanics of mutual no contact, giving you the tactical proof of exactly what happens behind the scenes when the silence becomes permanent. When a relationship between an avoidant and an empath collapses into no contact, two entirely different psychological engines begin running simultaneously. Most people view no contact as a simple tactical pause or a game of emotional chicken. In human behavioral dynamics, no contact is a high-pressure psychological pressure cooker. It strips away all external noise, exposes the true internal baseline of both operators, and forces a radical recalibration of power. What looks like cold indifference on the surface is often a high-friction battle between emotional processing and deep psychological avoidance. In the initial days of no contact, the avoidant experiences a massive spike in neurochemical relief because their attachment system is hardwired to view intimacy, vulnerability, and emotional accountability as dangerous threats of engulfment. The sudden silence acts as a relief valve. They register the empath's absence not as a loss, but as a restoration of autonomy. They engage in high distraction behaviors, convince themselves they were the rational party, and project an aura of absolute indifference. They assume the empath is sitting at home, obsessing over them, and that access to the empath can be re-established whenever they decide to reach out. While the avoidant is celebrating false relief, the empath is plunged into the horrific fire of acute attachment withdrawal. The empath's nervous system, heavily wired for hypervigilance and emotional attunement, goes into overdrive. The sudden cessation of communication triggers a physiological response similar to drug withdrawal. Cortisol floods their hardware, anxiety spikes, and the urge to break contact to relieve the pain is almost overwhelming. But when an empath chooses absolute, uncompromising no contact, this agony serves a vital purpose. It burns away the idealization, forces them to process the reality of the emotional neglect, and begins the hard work of rebuilding their internal baseline. As weeks turn into months, a dramatic shift occurs within the empath's psychological framework. Because the empath faced the pain head-on rather than running from it, their neurochemistry begins to stabilize. They stop looking at the avoidant through a lens of potential and begin evaluating them based on cold, objective behavior. They recognize that the avoidant's distance was not high-status authority, but a fragile defense mechanism driven by fear. The empath reclaims their cognitive energy, locks their boundaries, and transitions from an anxious pursuer into a sovereign, unshakable operator who no longer craves cheap validation. Just as the empath achieves genuine baseline calm, the avoidance psychological timer expires. Avoidance suppression is not healing, It is merely deferred emotional reality. As the initial high of independence fades and the empath's continued silence proves that this is not a temporary ploy, the avoidant's core fear shifts from engulfment to total abandonment. Phantom longing sets in. The suppressed memories flood back without the buffer of the empath's chase. The avoidant experiences a sudden, disorienting loss of frame, realizing that the person who once offered unconditional warmth has locked the door and thrown away the key. The final state of mutual no contact resolves in a total, irreversible reversal of the relationship dynamic. The avoidant, now desperate to relieve the pressure of phantom longing, often attempts low-effort breadcrumbs or subtle tests to check if the boundary is real. But they return to a completely transformed environment. The empath no longer operates on the old frequency. When the avoidant encounters the cold, calm, and indifferent boundary of a fully integrated empath, their fragile frame shatters. The avoidant is left stranded in the cold reality of their own making, while the empath walks away fully autonomous, permanently free from the cycle. Do not mistake temporary silence for total defeat, and never trade your long-term peace for short-term validation. Understand that holding absolute no contact is not about manipulating someone into coming back. It is the ultimate act of emotional sovereignty. Lock your frame, honor your boundaries, and let the mechanical reality of time expose the true value of what was lost. The divergent neurochemical trajectories of no contact reveal a fundamental asymmetry in how different psychological architectures process sudden emotional severance. When a high attunement, empathetic individual and a defensively detached, avoidant individual simultaneously enter a state of absolute silence, they set off two radically distinct internal cascades. To an outside observer, no contact appears to be a uniform state of non-communication. In behavioral mechanics and neurobiology, however, silence is an active, volatile medium that interacts with the specific attachment conditioning, threat detection hardware, and neurochemical baselines of each operator involved. Understanding this divergence exposes why the short-term reality of no contact is a complete illusion compared to its long-term psychological outcome. For the empathetic partner, the initial phase of no contact functions as an acute physiological detox. Their nervous system, which was previously conditioned toward hypervigilance, constant emotional attunement, and persistent conflict resolution, is suddenly deprived of its primary relational inputs. This abrupt termination triggers a massive spike in stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline, while dopamine levels plummet due to the broken feedback loop of the attachment bond. The empath experiences this state as physical and emotional agony, characterized by obsessive rumination, heightened anxiety, and an intense visceral urge to break silence simply to soothe their dysregulated nervous system. However, because the empath is forced to confront this pain directly, without the buffer of emotional suppression, their system begins the critical process of neurochemical stabilization. By enduring the fire of immediate withdrawal, they systematically burn off the idealization of the partner, dismantle the trauma bond, and begin integrating the hard reality of the emotional mismatch. Conversely, the avoidant individual experiences the onset of no contact through an entirely inverted neurochemical timeline. The moment absolute silence is established, their attachment system registers the sudden absence of emotional pressure, expectation, and intimacy not as a profound loss, but as an immediate restoration of safety and autonomy. Because their core psychological conditioning equates emotional vulnerability with engulfment and loss of control, the severance of contact triggers a rapid drop in relational anxiety. They experience a temporary surge of relief, self-validation, and heightened autonomy, often referred to in behavioral profiling as deactivation. During this window, the avoidant relies heavily on cognitive suppression, convincing themselves that they were the rational, self-sufficient party who escaped an overwhelming dynamic. They dismiss the severity of the rupture, assuming that their internal baseline remains superior and that the empath's silence is merely a temporary phase or a passive-aggressive ploy. This fundamental mismatch in initial processing creates a deceptive illusion of power. In the early stages, the avoidant appears cool, composed, and entirely unbothered, while the empath appears devastated and emotionally compromised. But this dynamic is built on a profound psychological debt that the avoidant has deferred rather than paid. While the empath is actively processing the grief, doing the heavy emotional labor, and building a genuine internal baseline of self-sovereignty, the avoidant is relying on a fragile defense mechanism that requires continuous external distraction to remain intact. The empath's acute suffering is finite, leading toward total emotional autonomy and structural boundary enforcement. The avoidance relief is equally finite, laying the structural groundwork for a delayed neurochemical reckoning that inevitably detonates the moment they realize the silence is not a temporary game, but a permanent closed door. The illusion of relief and deactivation represents the immediate defensive psychological coping strategy deployed by the avoidant individual the moment absolute no contact is established. When an intimate bond is abruptly severed, the avoidant's internal hardware does not register the event as a tragic loss or an emotional crisis requiring grief and reflection. Instead, their subconscious mind interprets the sudden silence as a profound restoration of safety, freedom, and personal control. Because their attachment system is fundamentally conditioned to view deep intimacy, emotional vulnerability, and relational accountability as direct threats to their autonomy, the sudden removal of emotional expectation acts as an intense psychological relief valve. They experience an immediate drop in internal friction, misinterpreting this sudden absence of stress as clear evidence that they are better off alone, that they were the rational party in the dynamic, and that they hold total superiority over the situation. This initial wave of relief is driven by a powerful neurochemical mechanism known as deactivation, where the brain actively suppresses attachment needs to protect the individual from perceived engulfment. To maintain this state of false liberation, the avoidant rapidly erects cognitive barriers against any emerging feelings of loss, guilt, or sadness. They distract themselves through hyper-independence, throwing their energy into work, social validation, physical fitness, or shallow, low-stakes interactions that demand zero emotional depth. During this deactivation phase, the avoidant operates under a comforting, grandiose assumption. They convince themselves that the empath's silence is merely a temporary strategy, an emotional outburst, or a game of chicken, and that the empath remains sitting at home, broken, obsessing over them, and waiting for the moment access is granted again. This assumption allows the avoidant to enjoy the illusion of complete freedom without actually confronting the terrifying reality of permanent loss. However, from a behavioral mechanics perspective, this state of cool indifference and apparent victory is completely synthetic. It is not authentic emotional healing or high-status self-sovereignty, but a brittle, high-maintenance suppression framework. The avoidant has not processed the relationship, resolved their core fears, or integrated the reality of the rupture. They have simply swept their attachment emotions into an unconscious vault, relying on continuous distraction to keep the door locked. Maintaining this level of emotional suppression requires significant cognitive bandwidth, making their internal frame far more fragile than it appears on the surface. Because their relief depends entirely on the false belief that they retain ultimate control over the timeline and can return to the empath whenever they choose, their composure is built on a foundation of sand, leaving them completely unprepared for the psychological shock that occurs when that control is permanently shattered. As time marches on, and the empath's silence transforms from a temporary pause into an impenetrable, sovereign boundary, the avoidance deactivation framework begins to experience severe structural fatigue. The continuous distraction strategies lose their potency, and the false narrative of total control starts to unravel under the weight of unrelenting non-communication. The avoidant begins to realize that the emotional pressure they ran away from was not an attack on their freedom, but the rare presence of genuine care and warmth, which has now vanished completely from their life. The synthetic relief that sustained them in the early weeks begins to curdle into a subtle, creeping sense of unease, exposing the fatal flaw of their defense mechanism. In running away to protect their fragile autonomy, they systematically dismantled the very bridge that anchored them, setting the stage for a delayed psychological collapse. The empath's sovereign paradigm shift marks the critical psychological transition where painful emotional withdrawal transforms into an impenetrable, high-authority frame. In the initial phase of absolute no contact, the empathetic individual operates in a state of severe dysregulation, driven by a shattered attachment system and the agonizing urge to seek closure or validation from the person who discarded them. However, when the empath commits to uncompromising silence, the nature of their emotional processing undergoes a profound structural evolution. Unlike the avoidant, who relies on deactivation and distraction to escape discomfort, the empath directly confronts the raw pain, the grief, and the reality of the betrayal. This willingness to endure acute discomfort without seeking cheap emotional relief acts as a fierce internal crucible, systematically burning away the idealization of the avoidant and breaking the neurochemical hold of the trauma bond. As the fog of withdrawal clears, the empath moves out of a hypervigilant state of relational attunement and into an internal locus of control. During the relationship, the empath's cognitive bandwidth was continuously consumed by monitoring the avoidant's subtle microbehaviors, predicting their emotional shifts, and shrinking their own needs to avoid triggering the avoidant's fears of engulfment. Through sustained no contact, this mental real estate is reclaimed. The empath begins evaluating the relationship through cold, objective behavioral mechanics rather than hopeful projections of potential. They recognize that the avoidant's emotional distance, hot and cold patterns, and sudden withdrawals were not indicators of high-status strength or mysterious depth, but the frantic microbehaviors of a fragile, fear-driven operator who lacks the capacity for basic human intimacy and courage. This realization triggers a permanent recalibration of the empath's self-worth and boundary enforcement. The empath stops viewing the avoidant's silence as a punishment to be endured and begins recognizing their own silence as a non-negotiable standard of sovereign self-respect. They recognize that over-explaining, begging for basic consideration, or accepting breadcrumbs of attention surrenders their personal leverage and lowers their baseline value. The desire for a cinematic confrontation or a tearful apology completely evaporates, replaced by a cold, quiet indifference toward the avoidant's opinions and actions. The empath no longer seeks to change, fix, or heal the avoidant. Instead, they lock their emotional doors, raise the friction required to access their presence, and direct their energy toward their own growth and sovereignty. By shifting from an anxious pursuer to an emotionally autonomous operator, the empath fundamentally alters the structural physics of the dynamic. They achieve what behavioral profiling terms full-frame integration. a state where their internal certainty and self-worth are completely decoupled from the validation or presence of the avoidant. When an empath reaches this milestone, their no-contact boundary ceases to be an emotional tactic designed to provoke a reaction or win a game. It becomes an absolute, permanent reality. They enter a space of total clarity, where the avoidant is stripped of their lingering psychological leverage, ensuring that any future attempt by the avoidant to test the boundary, drop breadcrumbs, or reclaim control will collide with an immovable wall of sovereign indifference. The onset of avoidant delayed attachment panic represents the catastrophic collapse of the avoidance defense mechanisms when the reality of permanent loss finally breaches their deactivation barrier. In the early stages of absolute no contact, the avoidant relies heavily on emotional suppression, convincing themselves that their sudden independence is a victory, and that the empath remains sitting quietly in reserve, waiting for a signal to return. However, this entire framework depends on a single vital assumption: that the empath's silence is merely a temporary emotional reaction rather than an absolute boundary. As weeks turn into months, and the empath's total silence persists without a single leak of curiosity, desperation, or outreach, the avoidant's subconscious mind experiences a profound and disorienting shock. The comforting illusion of total control shatters, exposing them to the terrifying realization that they have been permanently severed from the source of warmth, attention, and validation they took for granted. This realization triggers a severe psychological shift known as phantom longing, where the suppressed attachment system violently reacts to perceived abandonment. Because the avoidant never actually processed the relationship or healed their core fears, the feelings they buried during the initial deactivation phase burst into their conscious mind all at once. The memories of the empath that were once easily dismissed as smothering or inconvenient are suddenly recontextualized as irreplaceable sources of genuine safety, care, and depth. The avoidance threat detection system, which previously viewed intimacy as an existential danger, flips completely, now viewing the empath's absolute absence as the ultimate threat to their internal baseline. This sudden shift triggers an acute spike in relational anxiety, causing a rapid degradation of their emotional composure and exposing the profound fragility hidden beneath their cool, detached facade. As delayed attachment panic takes hold, the avoidant experiences a severe loss of frame, driving them to engage in erratic, low-authority micro-behaviors aimed at testing the empath's boundary. Because their pride prevents them from making a direct, vulnerable, and accountable attempt at reconciliation, they resort to indirect probing tactics designed to elicit an emotional reaction without risking outright rejection. They begin dropping subtle breadcrumbs, viewing the empath's social media stories within seconds of posting, liking old photos, sending vague or neutral text messages disguised as accidental contact, or orchestrating seemingly random appearances in the empath's physical environment. These low-effort maneuvers are frantic attempts to verify that the empath is still emotionally accessible, allowing the avoidant to relieve their internal pressure without having to take real responsibility for their past behavior. When these indirect probes collide with the empath's cold, immovable wall of sovereign silence, the avoidant's panic escalates into deep psychological despair. The total lack of response strips away their remaining leverage, forcing them to confront the devastating truth that their games no longer work and their presence no longer carries weight. They are left trapped in a high-friction loop of regret, obsessing over what was lost, and realizing that their relentless drive to protect their autonomy ultimately destroyed the only authentic connection they possessed. The very defense mechanisms they deployed to stay safe and in control end up executing their worst nightmare. leaving them stranded in a barren psychological landscape, haunted by the ghost of an empath who moved on, and entirely helpless to alter the outcome of their own self-inflicted isolation.